So I got my new crankcase. Bearings are in the freezer. Only difference I've noticed is that the drain plug has been updated on the newer models. Alright, so we've got our new crankcase. I've got my bearings in the freezer. I'm going to go grab them, start popping them in. I'll get back to you once that's completed. So, set that in there. Find a socket that fits the outer race of said bearing. So that's just the inner. That's no good. Still no good. I betcha it's this one. So that one fits the outer race all around. So we're going to tap that in. You'll hear a sound change. That's when you know it's in. So that's sitting pretty flush. I've got 1 and 2 in. I'm gonna go grab 3 and 4. We'll put those in and we'll do the crankshaft last. So the reason we want these bearings in the freezer is because the metal is gonna shrink. So these are down to about 15 degrees Celsius. I haven't heated the case and they're going in pretty easily. We've got our numbers facing out. You want your numbers facing into the crankshaft. So again, same thing. You want to get it started nice and true. Find a socket that fits over. I'm just going to grab a block of wood to shim this crankcase. Stop it from moving so much. Give her a little feel. It's nice and flush. Bearing spins, bearing spins, bearing spins. So next, find our numbers on this one. Our numbers facing in towards the crankshaft. Just finding a socket that's going to fit that bearing. This piece of 2x6. What I'm going to do is set it on there like that, and I'm just going to tap away. Just like that, the bearing is installed. Okay, next is the crankshaft. I've got the entire crankshaft assembly in the freezer. Alright, so here's the crankshaft. I'm not going to record myself putting this in, but I'll show you the process of getting it ready. So I'm going to have to block this up. So before I install this, I'm going to go throw it back in the freezer, block this case half up, that way the crankshaft will clear through. Okay, I've got this crank half all blocked up, so that way the crankshaft will clear. Just heating it back up again, just to make sure that it's going to go together nicely. Alright, I got the crank bearing installed. I'll give you guys a light so we can see a little bit more in here. It's installed. They do sit not quite flush. You'll know it's all the way in when you can look at it from the other side. And that little opening in behind this part of the crankshaft, just make sure your bearing's seated flush against the bearing race end. So once you're seated flush into there, it can't go in any further, so you're all the way in. A little bit of tips for installing. I tried using a piece of wood on the end of the crankshaft. didn't quite work. I found myself better to actually push on the bearing itself. And so what I did was used a long punch like this, and I just kind of walked around the outer edge of the bearing race. You'll want to make sure, because when you get to a certain depth with that bearing, your connecting rod is going to bind up on the crankcase, so you're going to want to make sure that your connecting rod is in between this hole for the piston. Yeah, so that's all the bearings you need to install. You've got one for your counterweight, your main bearing for your crankshaft. You've got these 3 bearings. Those are all, so this one's for your X drive, and then these are for your other gears. Yeah, so I'm gonna swap over the oil pump. I need this piece and this. I'm gonna swap that. Oh, and I'm missing this piece on the new one. So I'm gonna swap all these over to the new case half, and I will report back. Also, if your case half is messed up like mine was, it's not salvageable. What I did to get those blind bearings out is I just drilled holes on the back side of the bearings. Some up here too. The other ones I was able to punch out. Once you get those bearings out, if you end up drilling like I did, you'll see you'll get a bunch of metal shavings. I brought them inside, washed them out real good, ran some water through them, and then immediately threw them in some oil. So you want to make sure that you soak them in oil because you don't want these bearings rusting. And then after they were done soaking in oil for 5-10 minutes, I spun them around a little bit here and there, make sure the bearings were all lubed up. Threw them in the freezer overnight. So those bearings sat in the freezer for probably 12 hours. And you can see the crankshaft is still nice and frosty. So. One thing I did notice is I'm going to have to purchase a new oil drain plug due to this one being different. I bought a crankcase for a newer style Hisun because I couldn't find the old style, and I didn't want to buy another used crank half. So I'm gonna have to figure out where I can get one of those. I'm sure Amazon sells one, and hopefully that's the only difference. Yeah, I think that's going to be the only difference that I can tell. Got this is the old one. Got this is our new one. Alright, I got this little grommet thingy. It's for some oil passage. My tab was bent because of the catastrophic failure I had. It ripped this little piece somehow out of here. I think it went something like that. And so that got ripped out. So my piece of metal that secures this in place was bent. So I bent it back, got it as close as I could. It's holding that in there nice and tight, not moving around at all. So I think we're good. On to the oil pump. Alright, so when I was pulling this crankshaft out, I left a note in the video, but I was hitting on this. I didn't realize that there was some holes with threads, and so those threads are actually what you want to use to pull the old bearings out for the main section. With me hitting the end of the crankshaft with a block of wood and a hammer, it actually moved the crankshaft on the bearing. And so when I installed this one, I put my counterweight shaft in. The counterweight shaft was binding up on the inner edge of the crankshaft. And so what I did was block of wood on this side, hit it a couple times, and it moved the slightest every time. And so now you can see that there is a gap on both sides. It's as centered as I think it's gonna get. But now, every time that you spin this over and they pass through each other, they move freely. Before, it was rubbing, the back side of this shaft was rubbing on the inside of that. So I fixed that problem. So don't hit it with a block of wood. Use the holes that are there dedicated for pulling it. So if you use that threaded hole there, that threaded hole runs through the block to there. So set your crankshaft up like that. And then there should be another threaded hole at the bottom. And so just walk it out slowly. I did that on this one. So just thread one side in. Once it gets tight, thread the other side in, and just start walking it out side by side. And then you shouldn't have the problem of the crankshaft moving on the bearing, but if it does, just know you're able to smash it on the end of the hammer, end of the shaft, with a block of wood and a hammer. So yeah, once my parts get in, we'll get back to this, but for now, I guess this is part one. We'll see how long it's going to take. I don't think it's going to take relatively too long. Once we get those bearings in, it's all pretty straightforward. I took quite a bit of photos pulling it apart, so I'm not too worried about putting it back together. So I found out that they did change the crankcases a little bit on the new style Hisuns. So this crankcase that I have is designed for a 1.7 taper crankshaft, and I'm using a 1.5 taper crankshaft. So the taper is to do with where your magneto and flywheel mount. So you can use the 1.5 out of the old version crankcases, but you're going to need to use your 1.5 magneto, flywheel, and your cover. So as long as you can use all the gears to do with your magneto side, then you can use the new style crankcase, but you're going to need to buy an oil pump, because this is what the oil pumps look like. They're designed to pick the oil up from the bottom of the engine, and as you can see, you can't do that with this oil pump. So I'm waiting on a new oil pump, but this is the design they have. They've got a little dip in the bottom of the crankcase for you to be able to pick up the oil from the bottom of the crankcase. And so on the new crankcase, that's flat there, so your filter won't fit, so you need to get another oil pump. I'm waiting on mine. This is just the old oil pump that I took the screen out of. So the new oil pump's gonna have a hole on the back side, and that hole on the back side is where you're gonna suck in your fluid instead of on the front side. So the front side will be capped off. You have a hole here. You'll put your oil pump in, and from that hole on the back side, it's gonna suck your fluids in from that hole, which is pulling your fluids from the very bottom of the crankcase. And so with the new style crankcase, they changed the oil pump and they changed the drain plug. And so these drain plugs have a screen inside with a spring, and that screen is pushed up against the bottom of this, making a sealed surface. So that way your oil pump is pulling oil through this hole, and this hole connects to this little gap down here. So that's the difference. As long as you're using your 1.5 taper crankshaft with all of its accessories, you'll be able to use the new style crankcase. I had a hard time finding the old style crankcase, and they just wanted too much money for them. So I picked up the crankcase halves for the new style crankcases, I'm $800 Canadian, and yeah, with a new oil pump, I was $100 for the new style oil pump, $50 for my drain plugs, green and spring, so about $950. I'm still into it for less than $1,000, but I'm just waiting for my right side crankcase to show up. Your new style crankcase will not mate up to your old style crankcase due to the differences in bottom of the crankcase. So I didn't realize that until I got this one, installed my bearings, and then I went to go put my oil pump on. Doesn't fit. So once my right side crankcase shows up, I'll put up a video of me swapping all the rest of the stuff from this. We're going to be pulling out the X-drive shaft. I got to change this gear. I've got a new gear sitting right here. So we'll install this into the new crankshaft, or install that into the new crankcase. We'll use this shaft because this shaft and this yoke assembly are separate. They spline together right in there. So the shaft has to come out the back side.